So, confession time. When I first watched Fire Country, I told my mom and my dad that I hated Vince. I promised them that I would never like Vince, no matter how much my dad told me that he got better. And I would say that was true for about the first 19 episodes of season 1. Even as Vince was actively becoming a better dad, I still hated the guy. I don't feel that way anymore. In fact, now Vince is my second favorite character, behind Eve, tied with Wes, and ahead of Sharon, my previous favorite before I started working on this video essay series. During that first watch through, though, absolutely fucking hated the guy. That was up until the episode End of My Rope, and as soon as I watched that episode, I had a brand new nemesis, Walter Leone, still my least favorite character to this day. And somehow I hate him even more after this analysis. Hopefully by the end of the video, you will also hate him even more by the end of this analysis. I think the reason why is clear. Walter Leone is just like a Lifetime movie villain. Now, I'm in my late 20s, but a lot of my female friends are in their 40s and 50s, the exact age to love Lifetime movies, and most of them love Fire Country. Walter is loud, obnoxious, and somehow always drinking. He pits Vince and Luke against each other anytime they share a screen with him, and when Bodhi is there, Bodhi performs the role of flying monkey so well that he cannot see how terrible Walter's behavior actually is. He's just defending his no-no. Walter is the exact stereotype of the abusive dad that made our main character's dad the way he is. In these types of movies, usually both us and the main character have to understand what the dad went through before the two can reconcile. We have to go, of course Vince is the way he is, look at what he lived with. And Walter does that to a T. I mean, there's no question that Walter abused his sons. The only question in my mind as I write and record this essay in mid to late September is how does Walter treat Luke when Vince isn't around? And since you guys are watching this in mid to late November and the trailer for Fire Country Season 4 dropped a week ago as of this recording, you guys probably already know. Walter isn't just a stereotypical movie villain intended to humanize Vince. He's also a character that people almost paradoxically root for. During the post-season 3 hiatus before the trailer dropped on September 24th, I saw people on both Reddit and Facebook saying that they didn't want Walter to die. Frankly, I was confused by this. Even before I started writing this essay, I hated the guy. He is an abuser. There is no question he beat his kids. There is no question he emotionally abuses Vince. The only question I thought I needed to explore was whether he emotionally abuses Luke, since Luke is clearly his favorite. But after going through all the episodes with both of them in it, there's no question that Luke was abused by Walter. It's simply that the abuse that Walter does to Vince constantly overshadows it. But I have a blind spot. Like I've said before, my parents are in their 60s, so I haven't dealt with a parent in cognitive decline. When I go back and read those comments, it seems to me that a good number of those people don't want Walter to die because they are people that have dealt with a parent in cognitive decline. A lot of them are reminded of taking care of their own parents when they see Vince, easily the most popular character on the show, also taking care of his parent while his parent is dealing with dementia. Before I start talking about Walter's abuse of his sons, and there's a lot, I do want to talk about his dementia. This is not going to be an in-depth breakdown of Walter's dementia arc. I will get around to that in my season 3 essay series. But just like how Milkford allegedly would not have murdered me for fridging Riley, I'm pretty sure that Horser would not forgive me for not including some level of detail about Walter's dementia arc before I start talking about the abuse, since Horser does literally write media analysis about dementia for their college classes, and dementia is a very important part of Walter's storyline. By the time we get to Walter's second episode, the season 3 episode Welcome to the Cult, he's probably around 81 years old. By my count, about a year happens between At the End of My Rope and Welcome to the Cult. Near the end of Welcome to the Cult, Walter accidentally lights Vince and Sharon's kitchen on fire. Sharon is concerned about dementia, but Vince dismisses the fire as being caused by Walter being drunk. Walter himself says that the fire happened when he stepped out to turn off the TV. We see Walter again 6 episodes later, at the tail end of Coming in Hot, when he shows up for Bodhi's graduation a week late. This time, they cannot just ignore what is clearly a moment of memory lapse. By the next episode, The Leone Way, he has been staying with the Leones for a week, during which time Sharon and Vince fight constantly, and Bodhi takes Walter to Smokey's for breaks. During one of those Smokey's breaks, Bodhi decides to take Walter on the Leone Min family fishing trip, which stopped happening after Bodhi left. By the end of the trip, Walter's cognitive decline is undeniable to Sharon and Bodhi, even though it takes Vince until the end of the next episode to agree. Throughout the next few episodes, we see Walter's decline to the point where at the end of the episode Death Trap, Vince and Sharon have to install a security system to keep Walter from wandering off at night. In the very next episode, One Last Time, they take Walter to a memory care facility. 2 episodes after that, in Fire and Ice, Walter confuses Vince for Luke, who has been living in Japan for at least a couple of weeks. By the season 3 finale, he's so far in his dementia that he believes that he is battalion chief during the Buena Vista fire, wandering off when he's probably 20 feet from the door to get to the fire. He cannot even differentiate that the building is unsafe to be inside, so Vince has to practically drag him out, and this leads to Vince's death. So that's Walter's dementia in Season 3 in a very brief rundown. I cannot speak to what happens in Season 4 because, like I said, it's still September when I'm writing and recording this. But this is a Season 1 breakdown, and when we meet Walter in Season 1, he most certainly does not have dementia. Yes, he is refusing hip surgery, but if you've ever met a man over the age of 50, you will know that this is actually pretty normal behavior. If my dad agreed to have a medical procedure that he didn't think he needed because my brother said so, I might actually be concerned that he was dying. So we're going to take all these dementia moments, we're going to pack them in a box and label it to reopen in Season 3. Actually, one of the things that I think is most interesting about Walter is that in most contexts, the abuse and the dementia are separate. Don't get me wrong, Walter still does hurtful things to Vince while he's dealing with dementia, like calling Vince stupid when Walter shows up a week late to Bodhi's graduation. They're mean, sure, but that meanness is not what I'm talking about in this video. Now, I know I've only done the Bodhi essay, but these essays are specifically focused in Season 1. I'm going to try as best I can to keep them focused in Season 1 and put Seasons 2 and 3 on the shelf for those later video series. However, doing this with Walter is a little more complicated. He's only in 1 episode in Season 1. He is abusive, yes, but for you to see the pattern of abuse, I'm going to have to pull from 3 episodes in Season 3. Welcome to the Cult, The Leone Way, and One Last Time. I picked these episodes because while they do all have moments of Walter having a very clear dementia episode, those dementia episodes are pretty well separated from his abuse. There is one exception, but I'm going to talk about that later. Walter's abuse of Vince, and to an extent Luke, is pervasive. He doesn't just use one tactic. It isn't just about control, emotional abuse, structural abuse, intimidation, or games playing. It's about all of them. We see it in each of these 4 episodes that I've picked to go over, and all these examples are clearly in moments where Walter is not experiencing dementia symptoms. So the rest of this video is going to be me breaking down how Walter uses each kind of abuse against Vince or Luke, picking an example or 2 from each category in each of the 4 episodes. But first, let me recap the Walter-specific plots of each episode. In the episode At the End of My Rope, the B-plot revolves around Luke bringing Walter to Edgewater so that Luke and Vince can work together to convince Walter to get hip surgery. Luke has been trying on his own for about 6 months, and now, at the end of his rope, he has roped his brother into helping. However, before the 2 can convince their dad, he tries to run away, falls, and must go to the emergency room for evaluation. While there, he tries over and over again to needle a fight between the boys, which works when he drops the bombshell that Vince cheated on Sharon. Luke yells at Vince about it, and then Vince uses the cheating as evidence that we're all human, and getting surgery isn't weakness. It's admitting that sometimes we need help. The episode Welcome to the Cult takes place on Bodhi's first day of training, when Walter shows up to watch, as well as take over making Bodhi his first day of training steak dinner. Walter and Vince show up to watch Bodhi train in what's called the drill den, and Walter tells Bodhi how to cheat. Then Bodhi gets forced into cheating by Audrey, who doesn't want to fail and get kicked out of the program. Later that night, Walter and Vince are having a beer watching the game when Walter tells Vince that he helped Bodhi cheat. Walter uses Bodhi's status as a felon to attack Vince's parenting, and Vince reminds Walter that Walter's parenting involved physical abuse. Later, in a first sign of dementia, Walter sets the kitchen on fire. As I said before, the Leone way starts with Bodhi at Smokey's, while Walter tells a fishing story, admittedly to see who's gullible enough to believe it. He and Bodhi get to talking about the childhood fishing trips and how everyone lost interest when Bodhi left. This leads to a good old-fashioned father-son camping trip with Jake invited to tag along. Walter wanders away and stumbles upon a man in a car that left the road. Using just their long-acquired knowledge and the tools in Vince's toolbox, the 5 men rescue a patient, and Walter admits that he might have dementia. By the time One Last Time rolls around, Walter's dementia has worsened to the point that he has to go to memory care. All of his living family members have agreed, Walter too, but Walter doesn't remember that. Unfortunately, a storm stops them from getting there, so they are routed to the fire station to wait out the storm. While there, Walter and Vince have a big blowout where Walter says, "I'm gonna kick your ass," and Vince responds with, "Let's go, Dad." Sharon and Bodhi keep them apart, but later in the episode, Walter is restless and asks Vince for something to do. Eventually, Vince has Walter discuss thrill-seeking behavior with 2 young adults who nearly died chasing waves. Walter compares it to when he was thrill-seeking through firefighting. At the end of the episode, Walter agrees to go to Buena Vista. Now that we have a good framework for these 4 episodes, it's time to get into the abuse. When I first started watching Fire Country to track patterns across the first season, the patterns that I'm going to be exploring throughout this entire series, I created an abuse tracker, and that abuse tracker has different tactics, but it was sorted into 4 main categories: control, emotional abuse, structural abuse, and escalation/intimidation. These 4 areas are very similar to the abuse domains that are used in the Duluth Power and Control Wheel. There are more domains or domains that I collapsed into other areas. Also, full disclosure, I do not talk about one of the domains in the essay, and that's financial abuse. While it's true that Vince, Sharon, and Bodhi are paying for Walter's care, and that Walter's pension means that he should be able to make the payments himself, he frankly makes more than Vince does, or at least he should. It's pretty much unclear if Walter is still paying for expenses on his home, which are 45 minutes away from Edgewater. The timing on when he moves in and when he moves to the nursing home are kind of fuzzy. But there's another category that I had to add because it's not specifically on the power and control wheel, but you really need to see it to understand the full scope, and that's games playing. But I'll get to that one when we get around to it. Within each of these areas, I'm not specifically going to break them down by tactic type, but really I just want you to see how each area works across these 4 episodes and how Walter uses them to abuse his sons. I don't count physical abuse as its own category in my abuse tracker in Fire Country because we really just don't see any physical abuse on the show aside from body checking, and I slotted that into escalation/intimidation. We usually see body checking as a part of a larger abuse pattern wherein the abuser is getting frustrated. The other outlier is Vince's attack on Bodhi the night Riley died, as seen in Vince's flashback in the season 1 episode Bad Guy. Like I said in Bodhi's video, I don't think physical abuse was something that Vince did to Bodhi. Sharon and Luke are just too blindsided by Vince attacking Bodhi in that flashback. If physical abuse had been a part of what Vince usually did, I think that they probably would have anticipated that this could happen. In contrast, though, we absolutely know that Walter did beat his kids. Vince says it on 3 different occasions. We hear an account of physical abuse in At the End of My Rope. Vince says that Walter hitting his head at the station scared them, but they should be used to being scared because of what they got growing up. Moving over to Welcome to the Cult, Vince names the abuse for the first time. While his comments could be read as a general abusive dad trope, they're just too specific and also terrifying. "You know where I keep my belt, how fast I can get to it." To me, this suggests more than spanking, which is still bad, but abuse that was so common that just the threat of how long it would take Walter to get to them would be enough. There's no reference to physical abuse in the Leone way. It's an episode where there's no interpersonal crisis. By the time we get to One Last Time, we see more information about the physical abuse. After the blowout, Sharon comforts Vince by saying that Walter loves him more than Vince thinks. But Vince tells her that even as a kid, Walter showed his love through a belt or a fist. Vince isn't even sure that Walter will remember. Sharon's line of reassurance reads to me that Walter's forgetting isn't about it being insignificant, it's because that's how dementia works. So we never see Walter hit the boys. Not in a flashback and not on the show. But it's clear that it happened. And one last piece of information. We see over and over again that Vince doesn't do very well with any amount of yelling, and it doesn't really matter who it is. Bodhi, Manny, Walter, it's all the same. And the anger behind the yelling seems to matter since Vince does fine with loud voices at work for normal work purposes. Usually in TV, this is shorthand for past physical abuse. I would also like to point out that while Sharon is referenced to yell at Vince several times, it almost never involves actual raised voices, so maybe the word quarreling or arguing would be better? The first kind of on screen abuse that I want to talk about from Walter is control. Frankly, setting aside the physical abuse from Vince's childhood, I would consider control to be the most pervasive abuse type that Walter uses against Vince. It can take a number of different tactics, controlling how one is seen around others or controlling their relationships. Towards Vince, we most often see this as controlling his relationships with others, especially Luke, and framing Vince as the bad guy even before there's any need. With that in mind, let's walk through these 4 episodes. Walter has the least amount of control over Vince in At the End of My Rope, and that makes sense. While never stated, Walter is only mentioned in the series once before At the End of My Rope, and not mentioned again until Welcome to the Cult. To me, this suggests that Vince is either no contact or low contact with his father. Walter's control abuse is more focused on controlling how he and Vince are seen by members of Station 42, who I will remind you are Vince's employees. We see it in Jake and Eve's reaction to him. They act like it's Grandpa coming in on Christmas morning, even though Vince is grumpy as heck. When Walter starts chatting with the members of Station 42, he has this special guest star energy. The payoff of why Walter acts like this doesn't take very long. As soon as Vince and Luke try to talk to him about his need for hip surgery, Walter starts insisting very loudly that this is all Vince's fault, even though, Luke brought him here. We also see it later in the hospital when Walter tries to instigate a fight between Vince and Luke, saying that he can tell there's drama and then tries to figure out what it is. Vince calls it out, and while Luke doesn't say anything, it's quite clear he agrees. Walter's control of Vince in Welcome to the Cult is a lot more explicit. Early in the episode, Walter tries to alienate Vince from Sharon by framing Vince as a buzz killer when Vince expresses justified frustration that Sharon bought Smokies without telling him. Later in the same scene, Walter also frames Vince taking Walter to the drill den in that same light. Going to watch Bodhi pass or fail on his first day of training is department tradition, and Vince's desire to not crowd Bodhi is buzz killing. After Bodhi passes the drill den and Jake starts interrogating him about cheating, which, remember, Walter orchestrated, Walter creates a scene forcing Vince to take him home before Vince can find out that Bodhi cheated through Walter's help. Walter's motivation might just be keeping the cheating from being revealed, but it also keeps Vince from finding out about Jake's abuse of power toward Bodhi until the next episode, the entire length of Bodhi's first phase of training. In the Leone way, Walter's control takes the form of policing the relationship between Vince and Luke. Anytime the boys are seeming to get along, Walter throws out a jab, like that Luke caught more fish, or that Luke is moving away when that first comment doesn't land. We can also see how much Walter has manipulated Bodhi's perception of Vince, undoubtedly helped along by Vince's abuse of Bodhi. When Walter fails to keep the boys from a discussion about caregiving, he performatively rants about being treated like a one-legged dog and how he would rather die than be a burden. When he goes to his tent, Bodhi flips on Vince and Luke to defend Walter and attack their treatment of him. Walter's control in One Last Time is perhaps best summed up in the final moments of the episode. Vince and Bodhi, and probably Sharon, have had a discussion overnight. Through that discussion, they have decided that they will make Walter living with the Leone family work, even if it's been difficult so far. However, at the end, he declares he will go because Vince has now made it Walter's choice. Personally, I think it's interesting that as of season 3, Walter's patterns of control are specific to controlling Vince. While he does have some controlling behavior toward Luke, that control is keeping the two boys apart and feuding. This tactic works extremely well on the boys. Up until Luke gives Sharon his kidney, those two are constantly fighting, constantly undermining each other, or trying to make Sharon see the other one as having bad intentions behind his behavior. Spoiler alert for season 2, when the brothers are on their own without Walter's influence, they're able to run many of the same rescues with no problems or bickering. Emotional abuse for the purposes of this essay are things said and done just to hurt the victim. There's no big end goal like making the victim seem lesser in the eyes of someone else. It's purely about the harm. Walter's control of Luke's relationship with Vince seems overall like it's more about his pattern of controlling Vince, not Luke. But it's Walter's emotional abuse that it's clear that Luke is not a bystander or a tool, he's a victim too. I want to go over Walter's abuse of Luke first, and then I'll swing around to Walter's abuse of Vince. Walter's emotional abuse of Luke primarily comes through shaming Luke for a variety of implied deeds. We see it in At the End of My Rope. Yes, Walter's line of, "What'd you do? Get drunk again and say something stupid," is a Swiss Army knife of a phrase in which any response yields a clue to the subject of the boys' fight. But it's notable in that it's very pointed. It attacks Luke over a lack of self-control. Yes, this is in a private hospital room, but we see nurses walking in. We see Sharon just flat out barge in at the end of the episode. This room isn't private. It's a place where any doctor or nurse could walk in at any time. When we get around to the Leone way, we see Walter toss out a comparison of Luke getting a new job to having a mistress, even if Walter is saying it's not like a mistress. A mistress is a big interpersonal secret. Meanwhile, a promotion to leading the training of Japanese wildland firefighters should be something celebrated or bragged about, but it isn't captain of a small fire station, so to Walter it's basically nothing. So when it comes to Luke, Walter's comments are meant to hurt, but they're also meant to slot him into a role, and that role is incompetent. When Luke does something monumental, like get picked for a promotion, it's minor. If Luke makes a mistake, it must be because he couldn't control himself when he was drunk. Walter's emotional abuse of Vince slots him into a role too, but Vince's role is the role of the bad one. This is super clear in One Last Time. I know I promised to leave dementia scenes out of this analysis, but I think this one is important to bring up. Walter's lashing out. He doesn't remember that he had 2 conversations with Luke about going to Buena Vista. However, he does remember that Vince always manipulated Luke against Walter. And at the end of my rope, a big part of why Walter reveals that Vince cheated on Sharon is to put Vince in his place. Vince is understandably pissed that Luke asked Sharon for an affair, and Walter responds by telling Vince to get off his high horse because he cheated on Sharon. Later, when it's just Walter and Vince says that line about being scared a lot as kids, and Walter tries to gaslight Vince by saying that it wasn't that bad. Vince corrects him. It wasn't that bad when he or Luke did feats like acing a test or scoring a home run. I think the biggest moments for things said just to hurt Vince happened in that argument after the basketball game in Welcome to the Cult. After revealing that he helped Bodhi cheat, Walter tells Vince that if he weren't such a terrible father, Bodhi wouldn't have gone to prison and would instead be the captain. Walter also heavily implies that he had to help Bodhi cheat, especially since earlier in the episode he was yelling about how the Leones always win, and when it looked like Bodhi wouldn't make it out of the drill den within the time frame, he was clearly disappointed. Moving over to the Leone way, I know that I already picked "It's Not Like a Mistress" or something as a line of emotional abuse towards Luke, but this line does double duty. For Luke, it minimizes his new role, but for Vince, it's just shaming. It's a callback to Vince's cheating, even if Bodhi and Jake don't know what Walter is doing. Whatever Luke did isn't like what Vince did with his cheating. By the time we get around to One Last Time, you can see Vince's patience with the emotional abuse wearing thin, because Walter is just straight up openly trying to paint Vince as bad when he says, "You're going to complain about what a bad childhood you had just to justify your actions." As if Vince's childhood didn't involve, constant terror from his father. When Vince tells Walter he doesn't need to justify his actions because Vince's actions are reasonable, Walter turns to guilt tripping. He paints himself as the good parent after the boy's mom left. And that's when Vince cracks and yells that their mom left because she didn't want to suffer by staying with Walter. These aren't all of Walter's statements that are said seemingly just to hurt Vince. It's really just a small selection. I picked these because we see a pattern. Make Vince feel like he's the bad one. If anyone else is around, make sure they know that Vince is bad too. If Vince fights back, if he names the truth, try again with something else. Maybe emotional abuse works on Vince, but painting him as bad around other people shouldn't work, right? I mean, the people around Vince should see him as the competent fire chief who loves the town and the people in it, right? The emotional abuse is an important part, but you would think that Walter would try to hide it. But as you see, it is constantly in front of other people, Eve, Jake, Bodhi, even random background firefighters. But when I break down how Walter uses structural abuse against Vince, you'll get it. Structural abuse is really about one of two things, either abusing power over the victim or undermining the victim in front of others. And this can both be attacking the victim in a personal sense and in a professional sense. In Walter's case, he doesn't have power over Vince, but he does undermine Vince to members of Station 42 and his general ability to be a parent. Unlike the emotional abuse or control, most of these moments are small. They look harmless on their own, and if I was doing an episode-by-episode recap of the abuse and not breaking it out into sections, you would probably think I was nitpicking. But together, these moments paint a really clear picture. The structural abuse in At the End of My Rope starts from Walter's earliest scenes. We very quickly see Walter off with Jake and Eve, effectively his grandkids, talking to them about work. He sees a small detail that the engine isn't clean enough and asks the kids if Vince didn't teach them how to clean it properly. When Eve jokes about how Vince yells at probies for not cleaning them properly, Walter lightheartedly says, "Nah, it's baking soda and toothpaste," which I learned from Google is not actually a good cleaning solution because it's too abrasive. Also in that scene, Walter complains about the firefighters wanting to have a life outside work. And while I don't have proof that this is directly tied to Vince, Walter states it's the young guns that should know that all they need is firefighting. In Welcome to the Cult, the moments are just as small. The first one is in Walter's first scene where he says to Vince, "Vinny, that steak better have a nice fat cap on it." I know it seems small, barely noticeable, but the implication is what matters. We know from the season 1 episode Backfire that Vince has been dreaming of Bodhi joining Cal Fire since Bodhi was born. For the Leone family, the first day steak dinner is a part of that, but Walter just swoops in and tells Bodhi that he's there to make Bodhi his steak dinner. That night, after Walter has revealed Bodhi's cheating, he blames his ability to help Bodhi cheat on the program getting lazy. Now, of course, Vince isn't in charge of the program. That's the guy that the credits call John Clarkson. But Vince is in charge of Station 42, and that program is specifically the Edgewater training program, so it still feels like structural abuse. In the Leone way, part of how Bodhi is convinced to take Walter on the fishing trip is not just pointing out that they haven't been since they left, but that Vince and Luke lost interest. This is painted as this thing that Walter loves that ended because of Vince. When they get out to their fishing spot, Walter is quick to say that Vince picked a lousy spot. When it comes to One Last Time, we mainly see this form of abuse when Vince, Walter, Bodhi, and Sharon are walking into the station. Everyone is working on sandbags, and Vince is trying to steer Walter into the break room. Walter accuses Vince of acting like a big shot, reminding Vince that Walter has been a firefighter since before Vince was born. When Vince tries to fight back by reminding Walter that he was a chief a long time ago, Bodhi defends Walter, saying that he did a damn fine job as chief. Sharon tries to de-escalate. Later in that episode, we see Walter try to undermine Sharon, but she shuts it down while playing at being respectable. On the surface, these moments are small. Like I said, they would look like nitpicking if I was doing this episode by episode. But what we see across these 4 episodes is how Walter slowly and methodically chips away at Vince's credibility, both with members of the station and with Bodhi. It doesn't matter that Walter's advice is bad. It doesn't matter that he has dementia. It doesn't matter that he was fire chief a long time ago. All that matters is that the station sees that Walter is more competent than Vince. The escalation and intimidation tactic is really about trying to get a rise out of the victim to keep things going so the abuse continues. Interestingly enough, this category doesn't really include physical violence because, like I said, with the exception of body checking, we don't really see that on the show. Escalation intimidation is also things like yelling and threats or trying to provoke a fight. You would think that because Walter is an 81-year-old man and Vince is in his early to mid 50s, that we would see fewer moments of intimidation or escalation, but we don't. We see Walter yell in Vince's face in both Welcome to the Cult and One Last Time. In each instance, you can see Vince physically shrink away from his father. I consider the content of the yelling to be its own separate abuse tactic, but the yelling itself belongs here. In both instances, Vince doesn't yell back. He pivots to naming the abuse. In Welcome to the Cult, he names the physical abuse, and in One Last Time, Vince says that Walter committed an act that Vince would never forgive him for. That second one leads to Walter's "I'm gonna kick your ass" line, and Bodhi and Sharon have to separate the two. I have theories on what it could be, but since it's still September, I don't know if any of these theories are correct. If we know by the time this video goes live, I will pin a comment down below. Actually, no. If we ever find out, I will pin a comment. Other instances of escalation abuse are small, like in At the End of My Rope, when Walter tells Vince to mind his own business, or the Leone way, when Vince points out that Walter had a bad hip and needs someone to check on him, and Walter turns it back around on Vince to mock Vince's heart arrhythmias, which almost killed him in season 2. Also, Walter questions why no one told him about it. Gee, I wonder why. What's interesting about this type of abuse is that it's never aimed at Luke. Only Vince. When Luke isn't there, Walter is yelling in Vince's face, and when Luke is there, the escalation is toned down into mocking. Maybe that's because this just isn't how Walter abuses Luke, but as of the end of season 3, when I'm recording this video, we've never seen Walter and Luke on screen together without Vince there. So in this case, I tend to say this is more of an absence of evidence is not evidence of absence situation versus actual proof that Walter doesn't try to intimidate or escalate things with Luke. It could be possible that by the time this video essay comes out that I've been proven wrong. If you remember my second video essay where I talked about how I got into Fire Country, I talked about how the writers of Fire Country are really just playing games of cards with us, using the characters' settings and themes as cards in their deck, doing something akin to Magic the Gathering. Walter's playing a game of cards too, but it's not some friendly game of Magic. No, Walter is playing spades and he does not intend to lose. For those of you who haven't played spades, I've linked an explanation of how to play in the description, but what you need to know is that the main object of the game is to win the most tricks. Each round, every player throws out a card, and the highest card on the table wins. But you're not throwing out your highest card every single time. You're paying attention to what's in your hand, what's on the board, and what's already been played. You're trying to maximize the cards in your hand so that you win the most number of tricks, regardless of whether you get a good hand or a bad hand. That's exactly what Walter does. He strategically holds on to information so that he can use it later to hurt his kids. I've already gone over the tactics that Walter uses, so I'm not going to go over them again. Instead, I want to show you how his tactics work together to aim painful blows at Vince. But we've only got 3 examples here, not 4. There's no game in One Last Time, whether that's because his dementia is too severe to play a game, or because there was a game off screen and we just didn't get to see it, not entirely sure. Actually, I'm going to review these in reverse order because I think the game that Walter plays in At the End of My Rope is the most despicable thing he does in the entire series. Starting with the Leone way, the episode doesn't start in the living room. It starts at Smokey's with Walter telling stories about the past fishing trips, seeing who's gullible enough to believe that they caught a fish that was 6 to 8 feet long. He makes Bodhi nostalgic for the past, and while Sharon seems to know something is up, Luke and Vince are in denial. Bodhi is Bodhi. Walter is constantly trying to cause a fight between his sons, constantly getting between them anytime they look like they are bonding as brothers. It isn't until Walter throws out that Luke has a new job that they actually fight. Luke planned to tell Vince, but he hadn't worked out the right time. Walter decided this was the perfect time. It does start a fight, but about Walter's need for caregiving, so instead he turns on them, proclaiming that they're treating him like a one-legged dog. This isn't an attack, this is Walter pulling Bodhi into the game. When Walter exits, Bodhi attacks his father and uncle for making Walter feel bad. Walter wins the game. The game in Welcome to the Cult is the only one that Walter plays when it's just him and Vince, but it really shows how precise the game can be. Walter and Vince go to Smokey's and Walter picks up a couple of beers. When he and Vince arrive at the drill den, he makes enough noise to draw Bodhi over to him and sends Vince off to get his bottle opener. But as you can see here, Walter already had a bottle opener in his pocket, proving this was just a setup to tell Bodhi the cheat. Later, Jake almost exposes the cheat before Walter is ready, so he once again makes a scene, but this time it's so that Vince has to take Walter home, protecting the secret. Later that night, Walter brings up the cheat to attack Vince, but only after the two have been drinking and watching sports. Between the yelling and the attacks on his parenting, Vince names the physical abuse that he and Luke lived with, but you can see just how triggered Vince is. Walter gets the last word, sure, but it's a tacit admission that Vince didn't pass what he calls poison down onto Bodhi. So Walter does get shut down, but with how wounded Vince is, it's hard to call this anything other than a draw. Finally, we get around to the game in At the End of My Rope. Walter probes the boys enough to learn that they are fighting over Sharon. Luke throws out that he made a pass at Sharon. On first glance, it looks like a rookie move, but really, Luke is trying to shut Walter down. Luke is making it clear that Vince knows, that they already fought over this. But just like how in spades you cannot know what's in your opponent's hand, Luke doesn't know that Vince has cheated. Actually, Walter's first attempt to play the cheating card doesn't make Luke blow up. He's confused because it's so non-specific. Walter gets taken for tests before he can say more. Later, when the boys start on Walter about his need to get hip surgery, Walter makes it explicit. Vince cheated on Sharon after Riley died. That ends up being enough to get Luke first to get in Vince's face and later berate Vince about it in the hallway, where any passerby could hear what was said. Vince doesn't say anything about it, but Vince didn't need Luke to yell at him in public to make him feel bad about it. When Luke leaves the hospital room, Vince is on the verge of tears when he calls Walter a miserable son of a bitch. What is interesting here is that we don't learn anything about this affair. Yes, we hear from Sharon that Vince kissed another woman one time when he was drunk, but, I don't know. It seems like a lot of anger over a single kiss. I mean, I told my coworker about this, and she's like, if my husband did something like that, I would laugh. Walter clearly didn't intend to tell Luke anything about this cheating, other than that it happened. He only tells Luke more when the boys are trying to talk to Walter about his need for hip surgery, and Luke had already failed to pick up on that earlier hint. And Walter doesn't drop just any detail. Frankly, any detail that made it explicit that there was cheating should have worked. He drops the timing, that Vince cheated on Sharon after Riley died. Why though? Surely this big nuclear secret is the thing that Vince would keep secret even if all the other details of the cheating came out. Cheating on your wife, the mother of your child, after one of those children is dead and the other one has been driven away by you, should be the worst thing that Vince ever does. The one thing that Walter can use to put Vince in his place when he really needs to do something. This should be the most damning, the most humiliating thing that Vince has ever done. But to Walter, it's not. To Walter, the details of the affair are worse than the timing. And considering Walter's age, I can only think of one thing that, to Walter, would make Vince's cheating worse. Like I talked about a couple of essays ago, I'm going to be publishing a video that is all of the subtext about Vince being queer. But as I told these examples to my friends and to ChatGPT, they still weren't convinced. They were basically like, nice subtext to have going there, kid. Apparently not even Vince's death being announced on Bisexual Visibility Day is enough, but here it is. Here is the proof that you need that Vince is indeed queer. Walter clearly believes that the details of Vince's cheating are more humiliating than the fact that he cheated on Sharon after Riley died. To me, there's only one implication here. Vince cheated on Sharon with a man. When I was writing the conclusion to this essay, it had been a little less than 48 hours since the Fire Country Season 4 promo dropped. As of recording, it's been about a week. It got me so excited that I got distracted from working on this essay to spiral into loads and loads of theories about what might be going on right now. But today, I finally forced myself to finish. Frankly, what started as a quick project to be able to nail down my voice for writing these more structural essays, and yes, I know this is technically a character essay, morphed into a massive undertaking that I've been working on for weeks. In comparison, the other essays I've completed this far have taken just 2 days to write from start to finish. There's a reason I called Walter a Lifetime movie villain. This kind of pervasive abuse of a victim, isolating them, humiliating them, weaponizing the system against them, creating situations to abuse them over later, is the kind of thing that the media usually only gives to young women. Seeing it be told about a middle-aged man with a career and a family is both refreshing and terrifying. It's a reminder that this is not just the sort of thing that happens to attractive young women in their 20s. It can happen to gruff fire chiefs in their mid-50s. And it's not just the media. At the beginning of this video, I told you about the Duluth Power and Control Wheel. But if you click on the link, you'll see the so-called gender-neutral model. I think that the Power and Control Wheel is the most comprehensive material talking about abuse that I've ever seen, but it also only recognizes women. I'm not saying that abuse isn't gendered. The statistics say that women experience abuse, particularly pervasive abuse, at a much higher rate than men, but that doesn't mean we can just pretend that male victims don't exist. Fire Country fans often treat Walter's abuse of Vince as a thing that happened in the past, not something we watch unfold before our very eyes. There are other male characters on Fire Country who abuse Vince too, and as I work through the seasons of the show, I will delve into them. I had already put tens of hours into working on this video before the Season 4 trailer dropped, because whether or not Vince acts like Walter is a key question in the Season 1 finale. But now that the Season 4 trailer has dropped, people are already saying they feel bad for Walter because he has to live with Vince's death inadvertently being his fault, and it's important to remember what this man did to Vince. You're probably thinking that I wish Walter had died in the fire instead of Vince, but I'm glad he doesn't die. If he died, then the entire town would be talking about how, even in his dementia, Walter Leone had tried to save Edgewater. I don't think Luke or Sharon, or certainly Vince, would have been able to take it. It would have further mythologized a man who doesn't deserve to be remembered as anything other than the abuser he is. On the day of Sheriff Country's special premiere, they released a song for the show called Beat the Devil. It's very clear that Mickey is intended to be the one who beats the devil, but that begs the question, who is the devil that Mickey is intended to beat? Listening to it, I think it's very plausible that that devil is intended to be Walter. When I think of characters being elevated to literally the devil within their own story, I think of NBC's Hannibal. On its face, yes, Hannibal is a cannibalistic serial killer, and that is some of the most evil behavior I can think of. But he also has an infinite amount of charm, money, victims, and other serial killers to pin his crime on. He is fun to watch, and he even has a very twisted sense of humor. Hannibal isn't devoid of a desire for companionship. His main plot throughout the series is his attempt to find a suitable companion. Someone that can kill alongside him, appreciate him, and yes, maybe even love him. Walter Leone is not the devil in that sort of way. Elevating him to that level honors abusers as all-powerful. Walter Leone is a man who enjoys abusing his sons, especially his oldest, and broke them in the process. He broke Vince so badly that he went back into a building on fire on the verge of collapse just to rescue Walter. Even though Hannibal is a deeply flawed character, the Fannibals can read his twisted abuse of Will as love. Die-hard Fannibals see Hannibal not as an art house horror series, but as a rom-com. I don't think there's much, if anything, that Walter does towards Vince on screen that I could describe as love.